Hello and welcome back. This is the week 14 lecture. So today we are continuing to work our way through all those texts that I posted back in the week 13 module. So I've already discussed the two short works of fiction by Washington Irving, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Dolph Haliger. Covered those in last week's lecture, so make sure you get to those. Also, I've linked you to a couple of chapters of a longer work, basically an extended appeal on behalf of African Americans, written by Lydia Maria Child. So we talked about her a little bit in relation to Sedgwick. They were contemporaries, they're sometimes compared to one another, and like Sedgwick, Child published a pretty well-known frontier romance. Child's was called Hobomoke. It was somewhat similar to Hope Leslie in terms of subject matter, in terms of setting. They were both chronicles of sort of colonial New England. They both involved Native American characters. Hobomoke also involved interracial marriage. It was a bit controversial upon its publication, and I think it was 1825 or 1826, so right around the same time as Hope Leslie. So those two writers are often grouped together, even though Child was a bit different. One thing you might remember I mentioned when we were discussing Sedgwick is that Child was a real activist and a real social reformer. She was an abolitionist. She was an advocate on behalf of Native American rights, women's rights, better treatment of the poor. I mean, she had a lot of causes, a lot of social causes. And Sedgwick, even though a lot of her literature suggests kind of an early vision of American feminism, Sedgwick herself was not, as we talked about, not really overtly political and didn't really have a large sort of outsized role in public life. She mostly just stuck to her writing. So Child's more of an activist, and we can kind of see that in the appeal. So we'll just talk a little bit about chapters 7 and 8. That's all I asked you to read. We don't have access to that entire text. So just take a look at those two chapters. Also, make sure you read The Horse Swap by Augustus Longstreet. I just want to talk a little bit about that text today. Well, we don't have too much time for it, but it is sort of emblematic of a much larger literary movement that got underway really in the 1830s. The author of that piece, Longstreet, kind of helped to inaugurate the movement, and it became a pretty important early sort of comedic genre of American literature. So I want to talk a little bit more today about old Southwestern humor. The Horse Swap is an example of that genre, so we'll get into that a little bit. And then finally, The Prairies by William Cullen Bryant. Very important, pretty famous poem from the 1830s. Since we're not going to read the novel The Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper, I've cut that from the reading schedule. As I said before, we can at least read The Prairies, plural, the famous poem by Bryant, which came out around the same time as a lot of these frontier romances by Cooper, by Child, by Sedgwick. Bryant's writing in the 1830s, the following decade after Hope Leslie, after Hobomoke, Last of the Mohicans. Cooper's still writing frontier romances throughout the 1830s. So this is sort of Bryant's contribution to this larger discourse about westward expansion, the frontier, Native Americans, and it's, the poem's a great example of this process that we've been looking at really throughout the semester, but it's intensified here in the last couple of weeks, this attempt to really historicize the U.S. So we saw this in Sedgwick, sort of going back to an older period of American history. We just saw this last week with Irving. You can even argue that we saw it with weeks earlier with our anonymous text about the Tlaxcalans, right? I mean, these are all sort of portraits of earlier periods. They're all attempts to historicize this part of the world, sort of capture an older history, in some cases a history that predates European settlement. So Bryant in this poem is kind of tapping into that a little bit as well, and we'll get into that. I just want to cover the remaining text from the week 13 module that we haven't gotten to yet. Again, last week I really just talked about Irving, so we'll cover the rest today, and then really that's it as far as our discussions of actual literary text. So I've already announced that we're cutting The Prairie, our final, what was supposed to be our final major text. I just don't feel like we really have time to read it here at the end of the semester. And as I've mentioned, I feel like we might still be catching up on some previous texts. So make sure you have Hope Leslie finished soon if it's not already, and then just finish up all the texts in the week 13 module, and that's it. That's all that you will be responsible for. We don't have any additional readings beyond what you see in the week 13 module. So here in week 14, we'll wrap all of those up, and I want to talk a little bit about one of your upcoming assignments, the proposal and critical summary. This is kind of a small assignment. It's due at the end of week 14, but it is designed to help get you guys ready for our final papers. So I'll say a few words about final papers, but I'm mostly going to wait until next week. And in the week 15 lecture, I will not have any texts to discuss. So instead, we'll just talk about final papers and the final exam. I'll post a study guide in next week's module. We'll go through that. I'll talk a little bit about final paper, the requirements, all of that good stuff. But I've published the final paper assignment. The final exam, I'm still working on it. I'm finishing it up, and I don't really want to show you guys the actual exam beforehand. So instead, we'll look at the study guide next week, and really it's going to be, I think, a less stressful situation once you see the study guide. There will be some study required, of course, but you don't need multiple weeks to prepare. The best way to prepare for the final, of course, is to read everything that's been assigned over the course of the semester. So we did not have a midterm, so that means we will have a cumulative final, which will cover everything that we've read from the beginning all the way up to that group of texts. Again, in the week 13 module, there is nothing beyond that. Okay, so let's just start with the assignment that's coming up. I want us to start thinking about final papers. And again, the assignment's posted. You can essentially think about it as a sort of extended version of one of the critical responses. I want you to do the same kind of work, close reading. I want you to explore specific features of your chosen text, settings, characters, metaphors, images, motifs, key themes, whatever strikes you as interesting. We've covered a lot of potential areas that you can explore for virtually every major text. So there's almost limitless options, but you need to get specific. You need to dig in, just like we've been doing with these critical responses. I just want to see more of it. You need to cover more ground. And maybe the biggest key to remember for the final paper is you really need to be argumentative. You're really offering your own original interpretation, your own reading of the text. So you need to have a clear position, argue for that position, present evidence from the text that can serve as evidence supporting your position. Again, nothing really all that different from what we've been doing. It's just a bigger scale. So you need to think about what you would like to write about. I typically recommend just choosing a single text, but comparative essays can work potentially. So if you want to compare a couple of things that we've read, or if you want to take one of our texts and compare it to maybe a contemporary text or another American text from a different period, that could conceivably work out. But what I want you guys to do for this upcoming assignment is propose your idea to me. So clearly this upcoming assignment that's due here at the end of week 14, it's got two parts. First part is pretty self-explanatory. I just want you to write a short proposal telling me what you are going to do in your final paper. So tell me the text or the multiple texts that you're going to be writing about, and just briefly sketch your argument. You don't have to have it totally worked out yet, but I would like you to sort of indicate what you're interested in. Like, what are you going to be exploring? A couple of characters, an important setting, a particular theme, or maybe a motif, some kind of recurring feature that keeps showing up in multiple texts that we look at. There's really been several of those that we've tracked throughout the semester. You can really talk about almost anything as long as you're getting specific. Specificity is the key for an extended literary analysis. So I just want you to tell me what you have in mind, what you're interested in, and give me a general sense of the argument that you want to make. So you can keep that brief. Like I say in the instructions, just 1 to 3 paragraphs is really fine. A half page and a double-spaced correctly formatted Word doc would be fine. You can, have a full page, but you really don't need to go beyond that. The second part of the assignment is the critical summary, and this is going to take a little more work. So there is a research component to the final paper. I want you guys to do some research and bring in some outside sources. So part of this assignment is really, this part of the assignment is designed to kind of get you guys jump started on your research, and ideally you can get a lot of your research done this week here in week 14 so you don't have to do it next week in week 15. So I just want you to sort of talk about 3 different sources that you found so far. These are critical sources, scholarship. So I've provided some info in the modules about finding critical sources online using the GBC library databases. So a lot of you hopefully have some experience doing this. You might have done it in 102 for the big research paper in there. You probably have done some research in other English classes, other upper level English classes. I would imagine you had to do something very similar in my 451 if you took that class. So hopefully you guys know what I mean by the databases, but I've posted some tutorials in the modules that can help you to sort of navigate. You need to log in to the library homepage, but those are valuable resources. And the key here is we don't need summaries. We don't want paper mills. We don't want some of the stuff that's going to come up in a standard Google search. So when we're looking for scholarship, literary criticism on the text that we're writing about, we need to use, at the very least, Google Scholar. You guys might be familiar with that. It works just like Google, except it's for criticism, scholarship, theory, academic sources, scholarly sources. That's what we want. Peer-reviewed scholarly sources, largely coming out in academic journals, journals about American literature, also perhaps scholarly books, book chapters. All of that would be good. You might find some good stuff on EDU websites, but websites aren't generally as good, and just standard Google searches will not always give us what we need. So again, use Google Scholar, use the library databases like EBSCO, JSTOR. You're going to find good sources through those databases. Simply search for your title, search for your author. You can try other search terms based on what you're interested in, what you're looking for. You might want to find more information about settings, about certain historical or cultural contexts. There are situations where you might want to consult sources that aren't directly about the text that you're writing on, but they're about the historical period that your text is set in. That can still be a useful source. So, those databases can also help you find historical sources. Sources that might connect to some of the cultural contexts that you're interested in. So you have a range of options, but with this upcoming assignment, I just want to see that you guys have begun to research. I want to see some of the sources that you're finding and just briefly summarize them. That's all the critical summary is. So I want to see 3 sources, give me titles, maybe author names, and just tell me what they are about. And the final thing I mentioned in the assignment instructions is try to just be kind of aware of what kind of approach your articles or book chapters are taking. We haven't really studied literary criticism in this class. I'm hoping you guys have already been exposed to it a little bit in previous lit classes, at least enough to know that, there are different sort of schools or approaches of literary criticism that are common in the States. This is kind of, this has been an academic discipline really for not that long. I mean, maybe since the middle of the 20th century, but there are a lot of different approaches to literary analysis as it's practiced sort of academically in the US. So just kind of be aware generally of what kind of approach your sources are using. So a lot of sources kind of take a historical approach. They're looking at historical cultural contexts. Other sources tend to sort of take on a more political valence. So you might find sources that are kind of examining texts through maybe a Marxist lens or a feminist lens or a post-colonial lens, kind of exploring power dynamics, economic relationships, exploring oppressed groups and their experiences as they might struggle with the power structure. So just be kind of aware. Most of this is going to be clear in the articles as you read. What kind of approach is the author of the article or the book taking? Again, just kind of try to generally label it as maybe historical or political. There's also a brand of criticism that was, popular kind of in the mid 20th century. It's one of our older approaches, one of our older schools, often called formalism. And I'm teaching all this stuff in my 203 class right now. We haven't really gone through all the schools of criticism, but again, I'm hoping you guys have been exposed to some of them in the past. You might have been exposed to the formalists. They're kind of important. We've gotten a lot of key concepts from them. The whole notion of close reading, something that I ask you guys to do in the critical responses and also in your big papers. That's a concept really handed down to us by the formalists. They were also called the new critics. So before them, the traditional approaches to the study of literature were things like history, biography, moral instruction. We talked about that, how in the 19th century and going back certainly to the 18th century as well, literature was supposed to have a instructional value. It was supposed to teach proper moral behavior, so people would look at it through that lens, through a religious lens or historical, biographical, thinking about the author's own life, maybe looking at it through philosophy or even other fields, other disciplines, maybe social sciences. But formalism came about, and it was kind of a new approach at the time because it was all about appreciating really the text for itself. And that's where the whole idea of the close reading comes in. The traditional notion of the close read, we don't necessarily stick to this 100% anymore, but when the formalists would conduct a close reading, what that meant for them was that they were not considering really any outside circumstances or contexts. They weren't interested in historical or cultural context. They were just focused on the text, what appeared on the page. So they were focusing exclusively on like formal features of the language, metaphor, irony, paradox, imagery, certain meanings of certain words. It's a much more granular approach versus a more historical based approach where you're taking things in the text and maybe finding historical parallels. Maybe you're talking about the real life events that might have inspired the events in the text, or maybe you're looking at the author's life and attempting to create a parallel narrative there. So you see, it's very different kind of work. So formalism, or the new criticism, kind of was a response to those older, more traditional forms. And then there were responses to formalism, which tended to be a little bit more political in nature. Again, Marxist approach, the feminist approach. There's an environmental school of criticism, reading texts through an environmental lens, both texts about the environment and texts that maybe don't seem to be about the environment, but we can find interesting environmental meanings within them nevertheless. So there's all kinds of approaches. We're not going to try to be exhaustive and cover them all, but just be aware, kind of pay attention to the vocabulary that the author of your source is using, and try to kind of just make a general sort of classification. Is this, is this scholar using kind of a political approach, or are they more interested in sort of formal features of the language? So that's what I asked you in the instructions. Is the focus of each source more like on cultural or political significance of the text, or is it more focused on specific features of the text's language, more just locked in, kind of doing a more extended close read? Like, what do you see? What are these critics or scholars doing? So I've tried to put some info in the module to help you guys with that. But again, just spend this week looking for sources once you've selected the text that you want to write about. And I want to turn these around very quickly. Once these short papers come in, I will look at them as quickly as possible and get feedback to you, because I'll try to let you know if I think your proposed strategy for the paper will work. If your argument sounds good, I'll try to offer a little bit of advice. I might try to direct you a little bit, but if it works, I might not say much. I'll just tell you to get started on the paper. If it needs some work, we can work together. We can always do a video conference or talk more through email. But just a final thought on assignments before we turn to our texts for this week. What I'm going to do for the final exam and the final paper, I'm just going to give you guys until basically the end of exam week. So I think that's, the 21st. That's the Friday of exam week, May 21st. That's pretty much the last day that I'll be able to accept work. Grades are due, I believe, the following Monday or maybe the following Tuesday. So I'm going to need that entire weekend to grade. So that Friday, May 21st, that's when everything is due, both the final exam and the final paper. So you guys can do those assignments in whatever order you want to. The sequence is up to you. It doesn't really matter to me. I just want them both in by the end of the day on the 21st. So again, tackle this upcoming assignment to get you started on the final paper. You can start locating your sources, you can figure out what you're going to write about, and you'll give me a chance to provide a little bit of direction if you need it. And if you just need affirmation or confirmation that your idea is good, I'll provide that. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions about the assignment, and I will get those back to you as soon as possible. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the texts that I posted. I want to start just briefly with the horse swap. We don't, it's a short little comic tale. We don't need to spend too much time on it, but I do just want to talk about Southwestern humor a little bit, and I'm going to post another example of the genre. I don't think the horse swap is quite enough. It's very characteristic of the genre, but I want to give you one more example before the week is up. But Southwestern humor is kind of the last major literary movement that we're going to sort of talk about or be responsible for in this class. So obviously our time period is winding down. The era of the New Republic is generally thought to end in the 1830s, maybe in 1830, maybe in 1835. Sometimes it gets extended all the way up to 1840, but not usually beyond that. So we're pretty much at the end of the period this week as we move into the 1830s with the Longstreet story, with the Prairies, and also with Child. So this is the end of the road for us, and this is, again, kind of this pivotal moment. We're leaving at an important time, but we've done our work, because what we're getting to now in the 1830s is really the development, the still kind of early stages of a development that would reach its fruition in the middle of the 19th century, typically thought to be in the 1850s. So if you guys, those of you who took my 451, you'll remember this term because we talked about it a lot in there. the American Renaissance. This is a period that was generally thought to be kind of the first true flowering of American lit, a sort of native national literature unique to us that could finally sort of compete on the world stage with the older literary traditions of places like England and other European countries. So we've kind of questioned or complicated this traditional narrative of American lit, but for a long time, this is how we looked at it. We looked at a small group of writers that came to prominence in the middle of the 19th century as being the ones who really sort of put their stamp on American literature and really helped to create what we now think of as American literature. So these are big names in the field, and most of you, even if you haven't really read them, you've at least heard of them. We're talking about Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. All of those guys, they were all kind of writing at around the same time, and some of them were writing as early as the 1830s. Again, the real pinnacle of this period of American literature was often thought to be kind of the end of the 1840s and the first half of the 1850s, a period where we saw a lot of really important books published. Moby Dick, Leaves of Grass, The Scarlet Letter, a lot of these texts that are kind of held up as classic American lit. And again, those all male founders of American literature were sort of given a lot of credit for a long time, and they still are given a lot of credit, and much of it's deserved. But what we've looked at is this earlier era of American literature. So part of what we're doing, I mean, it is part of a larger project to kind of push back a little bit on the assumption that American literature was sort of created in the 1850s, because as we've seen, there were a lot of writers and a lot of pretty interesting texts and sort of, emerging genres that were happening and sort of appearing throughout the first half of the 19th century and even going back to the end of the 18th century. So we don't necessarily think of the American Renaissance the same way now that we thought about it several decades ago, but it's still considered a very important period. And if you study 19th century American lit, the century as a whole, you're definitely going to spend a lot of time with that group that I just mentioned. So we're kind of getting right up to the point at which that era really begins, that era that was traditionally thought of as the American Renaissance. So by the 1830s, Hawthorne is writing, Poe is writing. Not all of those figures are active yet, but that's sort of the next step. And what we've seen over the course of the 1820s and the 1830s would continue for the next several decades, this search for an original American literature that was unique from other literatures. And we've seen a lot of these earlier writers invested in that project. Sedgwick sort of exploring a unique region, unique regional characteristics, and also historicizing America. We talked about that a lot in relation to Hope Leslie. She's exploring, the colonial history of Puritan New England. And then last week we look at Irving doing something a little bit similar, different style, different tone, little bit of a different genre. He's not really doing frontier romance in the same way, but like Sedgwick, he's interested in a unique American region, the regional characteristics or cultural traits of that particular place. And what makes Irving's place interesting is it kind of has a non-English history, a non-British history, that unique Dutch corner of upstate New York along the Hudson River. So now when we look at the horse swap, we're moving to another American region. Now we're moving to the American South. And we haven't read anything from Southern writers so far in this class. Part of that is because Southern literary culture does develop a little bit later than the literary cultures that we've already seen primarily in New England, but we also saw Brown working in Philadelphia. We know that Irving was a New Yorker. So those major urban centers in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, those were the initial centers of literary production. Boston certainly was, New York, Philadelphia to an extent. But as you moved further south, there were fewer printing presses, there were fewer publishing companies putting out books, although there were still some. And you just had cultural difference. So in the South, you had obviously, a plantation economy, a slaveholding culture that was not totally unfamiliar in other parts of the country, but by the 1820s and 1830s, a time by which a lot of other American states had already abolished slavery, the South was becoming increasingly distinguished by its slaveholding culture and its kind of unique economic conditions. So we're moving now to a different region, but some of the same larger goals. Longstreet is a humorist, and he's a part of this movement that we refer to now as Old Southwestern humor. So don't be confused by that term. We don't mean Southwest in the way that we mean it today. We're not talking about Arizona or New Mexico. We're talking about the Old Southwest, which is now just thought of as the larger South. We're talking about places like Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, parts of Louisiana, Arkansas, but even the western reaches of Georgia. And that's where we find ourselves in this particular story. This is a part of a larger collection called Georgia Scenes, which was published by Longstreet in 1835. And it's generally thought to be kind of the text, the collection that kicks off Southwestern humor. So Longstreet sets a lot of the templates and sort of the stylistic sort of standards for this genre that other writers who also worked within the genre would use. And this would become a very popular type of American literature over the next several decades, beginning in the 1830s and really extending all the way up to the Civil War. So Longstreet was a well-known practitioner. Other writers that did it included T.B. Thorpe. I might post his famous story, the Big Bear of Arkansas. That's kind of a canonical, classic example of Southwestern humor. William Gilmore Simms, Johnson Jones Hooper. These are figures that have largely been forgotten today. They're not really read that much anymore, and most of the fiction that they produced was short fiction. Most of it was published in periodicals, newspapers. A few, like Longstreet, collected a lot of their short works and published them in book form, like Georgia Scenes, but a lot of them were never collected. So they were kind of ephemeral. They were kind of popular lit. A lot of them appeared in cheap periodicals. They weren't really thought of as high culture. They were comic, and they were very episodic, usually short, often referred to as sketches. Sometimes they wouldn't even really rise to the level of a fully developed short story. Not really like what we saw with Irving. Like you see with the horse swap, it's short. There's really not much of a plot to speak of. It's very characteristic of Southwestern humor. It's largely a character study, and the genre would largely mirror the part of the country in which much of it was set. So throughout the early 19th century, what was then kind of thought of as Southwest was rapidly being settled by Anglo-Americans. So prior to the early 1800s, much of Alabama, Mississippi, what would later become just part of the South, that was still controlled by a variety of Native American tribes in the Southeast. So the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, they were pushed out and removed by 1830. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a political development that Sedgwick was responding to and really sort of engaging with in Hope Leslie, as she argues for the humanity of Native Americans. But like we talked about, there was still this kind of unsettled political question in the 1820s. what is the U.S. government going to do with the Native Americans who remained east of the Mississippi? And the answer was the Indian removal policy implemented by the Jackson administration, which rounded up mostly southeastern Native Americans and forced them off their land. Most of them were resettled in what is now the state of Oklahoma, parts of Arkansas as well. So that's kind of the backdrop to a lot of Southwestern humor. After the Native Americans were dispossessed of all of that land, you had a huge rush of Anglo-American settlement. And as you can kind of imagine, that destabilized things. There was kind of this frontier environment, anything goes. There was a lot of land speculation, a lot of drinking, a lot of disorder. Like, just think about what we now associate with the Old West of the late 19th century, right? The sort of classic Western scenario with saloons and bandits and, tough sheriffs. That same kind of environment existed, in a similar way about 60 or 70 years earlier on an earlier frontier, sort of close to the Mississippi River. So that's kind of the environment that a lot of Southwestern humor taps into. There's a lot of tricksters, gamblers, ruffians, a lot of colorful characters, and frankly, there's often a very frank accounting of crime and sort of grifting, scheming, a lot of people trying to cheat one another out of horses, out of land, out of slaves. Slave trading was rampant. So you're getting just a little taste of that kind of world here in the Horse Swap, where, again, the whole, premise centers around these two guys who are both trying to cheat the other to some, comic effect. There's really no plot to speak of, but Longstreet sets a lot of the Georgia scenes in what was then kind of thought of as Western Georgia. And Georgia was a seaboard state. It had been a colony. The coastal part was settled, and there were big plantations, but Western Georgia was still thought of as a little bit wild, and much of it had previously been under the control of the Cherokee Nation, and they, along with the Creeks and the Chickasaws and the Seminoles and the Choctaws and other southeastern Native Americans, had been largely removed, although some were able to stay behind. But a lot of areas of western, sort of northwestern Georgia that had not really been settled by Anglo settlers during the colonial period was sort of opening up for settlement in the early decades of the 19th century. So Longstreet is sort of capturing this atmosphere, this kind of frontier atmosphere, where there's a lot of disorder, there's a lot of rowdiness. And one thing you'll notice is that the narrator of the story is kind of detached from the action. This is very typical of old Southwestern humor. The narrators are typically outsiders who are sort of visiting some rural, kind of backcountry, environment, and they're commenting on what they see. They're often sort of poking fun at it. There's kind of a satirical register that they often operate in, but they're sort of observing it, sometimes romanticizing some of the backcountry characters, but there's also a lot of frank portrayals of violence and crime and brutality. I mean, some Southwestern humor strikes modern readers as a bit shocking because it can be violent and a little bit bawdy, and at times, it kind of went against popular decorum and what would have been thought of as good breeding or manners, but that's part of the joke. So, a lot of people think that Southwestern humor is one of the early sort of, original U.S. comedy genres, and we haven't really seen a lot of comedic stuff in this class. Brackenridge was kind of funny, very much working in a satirical vein that was typical of 18th century texts, like we've talked about. But here, it's a different kind of humor. And to me, Southwestern humor, there is that satirical element from the narrator, but a lot of the comedy is physical. And you don't quite see that in the Horse Swap. So that's why I'm going to post some new stuff later in the week, because a lot of the comedy in Southwestern humor is kind of crude. It's a little, and it's a little more, I think, has kind of a broader appeal, and I think is a little more reminiscent of a lot of comedic tropes that we see today. Again, more broad, physical humor, maybe at times some bathroom humor, some kind of bawdy speech. There's also a great pleasure taken in dialect. And that's true of a lot of these texts that tackle particular regions. And it's very much true of Southwestern humorists. They really try to capture the unique way that people in this part of the country spoke. So you often have dialect that can be a little bit difficult to understand for the modern reader. But that's kind of part of the charm. That's part of the appeal. So there is, it's supposed to be funny. We're kind of invited to laugh at these bumpkins, these sort of rural characters. But in a lot of Southwestern humor, we might also be invited to laugh at the sort of snobby narrator who might come from a more sort of civilized seaboard area, maybe a coastal city where things are different and he feels more cultured, he feels kind of superior to the characters on display. So the comedy cuts a lot of different ways, but this was a popular genre for several decades. And again, it's kind of thought of as, again, uniquely American. There's not a lot of clear predecessors that kind of grew out of this land craze in what was called the Old Southwest during this period. So, the humor often rests on the dispossession of the Native Americans. That doesn't show up very often as a subject matter in the text, but we've already kind of explored it, at least through Hope Leslie. So we know kind of what was going on politically, as the backdrop to a lot of these texts. Southwestern humor is coming a little bit after Indian removal, but it's part of that legacy, right? The only reason a lot of these areas had been opened up to Anglo expansion was because the Native Americans had been forced out. So land was often readily available. So you had people pouring out of these seaboard cities in places like Virginia, the Carolinas, and they were going west to places like Mississippi, Alabama, maybe Arkansas to buy land and strike it rich. So that was happening, and this genre kind of documents it a little bit. But if you read a lot of Southwestern humor, and again, you see it in the horse swap, there's this real sort of thread or sort of a trope of criminality that runs through a lot of it. If you took my 451, we looked at a little bit of this genre in the form of Simon Suggs, who was a famous creation of another humorist named Johnson Jones Hooper, who lived in Alabama around the same time that Longstreet was living in Georgia. And Simon Suggs was, a trickster, really a criminal, kind of a con man, sort of a confidence man, in the traditional sense of that word. He had a lot of schemes to separate people from their money. And we're invited to laugh at him. We're invited to laugh at his victims, but he's not exactly an upstanding citizen, and a lot of the humorists make the point that in a frontier region, a lot of scoundrels and rascals and sort of renegades can find a lot of, opportunity in places where the alcohol and the money are, sort of flowing freely, and there's lots of land deals being struck. So Suggs has a famous line that it gets repeated throughout Hooper's stories. He says, "It's good to be shifty in a new country." And that's kind of the whole idea. And I think that's a mentality kind of embodied by our characters in the horse swap as well. They're always trying to get over on somebody, get something for nothing. And that's where a lot of the humor comes from. So, yeah. Southwestern humor, the reason we kind of remember it today, I think it's kind of fun in its own right, but a lot of people generally only remember it as kind of an important influence for someone like Mark Twain, who was very much aware of Southwestern humor and probably read a good bit of it while he was a young man. So when he's writing Huck Finn and some of his future works, he's at least aware of this sort of pre-existing tradition. He's aware of the works of Longstreet and Hooper, George Racine, Simon Suggs. He read that stuff. So Twain is often thought of as kind of continuing certain traditions of Southwestern humor, the satire, the physical humor, similar settings, similar types of characters. But of course, he's kind of doing it at a higher level, and we still read Twain. But if we want to understand one of his big influences, we can look at something like Longstreet's The Horse Swap. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop. That'll be part one, and then we'll come back in part two, talk a little bit about Child, the prairies, and whatever else I said. That might have been it. Okay, we'll be right back.